George Washington, the indispensable man. The final breath. Unsuccessful, the winter wind rattled the windows of Mount Vernon on that December evening in 1799, as if the very house knew what was coming. Inside the bedchamber, candlelight flickered across the face of a man who had defied empires, crossed frozen rivers, and built a nation from nothing. George Washington lay in his bed, his breathing labored, his throat constricted by an infection that no amount of bloodletting could cure. 3 physicians surrounded him, their faces grave, their remedies futile. They had drained nearly half his blood, blistered his throat with heated glass, administered every treatment known to 18th century medicine. Nothing worked. Martha sat nearby, her face she had been his partner for 40 years, through war and peace, through triumph and despair. Now she watched as the man who had seemed indestructible slowly slipped away. Washington knew what was happening. He had faced death before, had heard bullets whistle past his head, had seen men fall beside him in battle. But this was different. This time there would be no escape, no miraculous survival, no victory against impossible odds. Around 10 o'clock that evening, Washington struggled to speak. His voice, once commanding enough to hold an army together through the darkest days of winter, now barely rose above a whisper. He spoke to his secretary, Tobias Lear, giving final instructions with the same attention to detail he had applied to everything in his life. He asked Lear to arrange his military papers, to ensure his affairs were in order. Then he said something that captured the essence of who he had always been. "I die hard, but I am not afraid to go." Between 10 and 11 o'clock, George Washington drew his final breath. The man who had been called the father of his country, who had led ragged soldiers to impossible victories, who had presided over the birth of a nation, was gone. The room fell silent, except for Martha's quiet weeping and the crackling of the fire. Outside, the Potomac River flowed dark and cold beneath winter stars, indifferent to the passing of the greatest American who had ever lived. News of Washington's death spread slowly at first, traveling by horseback and ship across the young republic. When it reached Philadelphia, then the nation's capital, Congress stopped all business. When it reached New York, church bells tolled for hours. When it reached Boston, citizens wept openly in the streets. Over the next weeks, more than 400 memorial services would be held across America, each one attempting to capture what the nation had lost. How do you eulogize a man who seemed larger than life itself? How do you measure the impact of someone who had been there at every crucial moment, whose character and choices had shaped the very idea of America? Henry Lee, who had fought alongside Washington in the Revolution, found words that would echo through history. First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. But even those famous words couldn't fully capture what Washington had accomplished. He had done something that seemed impossible in an age of kings and emperors. He had won a war, created a government, served as its leader, and then voluntarily walked away from power. He had proven that a republic could work, that ordinary citizens could govern themselves, that power didn't have to corrupt. But how did he become this man? What forged him into the leader who would define American democracy? The story begins not with glory and triumph, but with loss and hardship in the Virginia countryside, where a young boy learned that life offers no guarantees, that survival requires discipline, and that character matters more than birth or wealth. Forged in Virginia's soil. The world George Washington entered on February 22, 1732, was not one of privilege and ease, despite what later mythology would suggest. He was born at Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia, the first child of Augustine Washington and his second wife, Mary Ball. His father owned several plantations and had invested in an iron furnace, making the family moderately prosperous by colonial standards. But Augustine had children from his first marriage, older half-brothers who would inherit the best properties and the family's social standing. George, the eldest son of a second marriage, would have to make his own way in the world. The family moved to a farm, later known as Ferry Farm, situated across the Rappahannock River from Fredericksburg. The property sat on a steep hill overlooking the water, and the climb from river to house would have tested even the strongest legs. This was no accident. Everything about Ferry Farm spoke to the realities of Virginia plantation life, where enslaved people's labor made everything possible, where social hierarchies seemed as permanent as the river itself, and where a boy's prospects depended largely on luck and family connections. George spent his childhood here, watching the river traffic, exploring the woods, learning the rhythms of agricultural life that would shape his entire existence. Then, on April 12, 1743, everything changed. Augustine Washington died unexpectedly at age 49, just 5 years after moving the family to Ferry Farm. George was 11 years old. In a single day, he went from being a prosperous planter's son with prospects to a boy whose future had become suddenly uncertain. His older half-brothers inherited the best properties. Lawrence, his eldest half-brother, got Little Hunting Creek, which he would rename Mount Vernon. George inherited Ferry Farm and 10 enslaved people, but he wouldn't legally own them until he turned 21. In the meantime, his mother, Mary Ball Washington, would manage the property, and George would have to help her run it. This loss shaped everything that followed. While his half-brothers had been sent to England for education at the Appleby School, George would receive only basic schooling from a local rector named James Marie. No Latin or Greek, no classical education, no finishing at one of England's great schools. Instead, he learned mathematics, reading, writing, and practical subjects like surveying. He copied out by hand a book called Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation, a contemporary guide to manners and morality. These rules became his code, teaching him self-control, respect for others, and the importance of appearing dignified in all circumstances. Rule number 1. Every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present. Rule number 56. Associate yourself with men of good quality if you esteem your own reputation. Rule number 110, the final rule. Labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. Young George internalized these lessons with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He worked on controlling his temper, which could flare hot and fierce. He practiced his penmanship until it became elegant and precise. He studied the manners of the Virginia gentry, learning how they moved, how they spoke, how they commanded respect. He was tall for his age, growing to over 6 feet, with powerful shoulders and large hands built for physical labor. The daily climbs up and down Ferry Farm's steep hill developed his legendary strength and stamina. Visitors to Ferry Farm later noted that the property's extreme slope explained Washington's remarkable physical condition. A man who grew up making that climb multiple times every day would be ready for anything. But physical strength and good manners weren't enough. Washington needed a profession, a way to establish himself. At 16, he found one through his brother Lawrence's connections. Lawrence had married into the Fairfax family, one of the most powerful in Virginia. Lord Fairfax, who held a vast land grant in the Shenandoah Valley, needed surveyors to map his properties. Washington learned the craft quickly, mastering the mathematics and instruments required. In March 1748, just after turning 16, he accompanied a surveying party into Virginia's western frontier. That first expedition into the Shenandoah transformed him. For a month, Washington traveled through wilderness that seemed endless, sleeping in tents, fording rivers, encountering Native Americans, and learning what life looked like beyond the plantation society of Tidewater, Virginia. He surveyed land, kept meticulous notes, and earned decent money. More importantly, he saw opportunity. The frontier was opening up, and those who got there first, who understood the land and knew how to acquire it legally, could make fortunes. By age 18, Washington had used his surveying income to purchase 1,459 acres of land in the Shenandoah. He was on his way. Yet even as Washington built his surveying business and acquired property, he yearned for something more. He wanted military glory, the kind of honor that came from serving the crown. When Virginia's Lieutenant Governor, Robert Dinwiddie, needed someone to carry a message deep into the Ohio country in 1753, Washington volunteered, despite his youth and limited experience. He was 21 years old, ambitious, hungry for recognition, and about to walk straight into a conflict that would reshape the world. Baptism by fire. The Ohio River Valley in the 1750s was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Both France and Britain claimed the region, and both empires were building fortifications to enforce their claims. Virginia had its own interests through the Ohio Company, which held royal permission to settle lands that France considered theirs. Into this tinderbox, Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie sent young Major George Washington with a small party of men and a simple message. The French must leave, or face consequences. Forged Washington's journey began in late October 1753. He traveled north through increasingly harsh weather, reaching Fort Le Boeuf near present-day Erie, Pennsylvania, in mid-December. The French commander received him courteously, but dismissed Virginia's demands with barely concealed amusement. Of course they wouldn't leave. The Ohio Valley was French territory, and no letter from a colonial governor would change that fact. Washington returned to Williamsburg, having failed in his diplomatic mission, but he had learned something valuable. He had seen French strength firsthand, observed their forts and troops, and understood that conflict was inevitable. He published an account of his journey that made him briefly famous on both sides of the Atlantic. A young colonial officer venturing into the wilderness to confront French power made for compelling reading. Dinwiddie, impressed by Washington's determination and his ability to command respect despite his youth, promoted him to lieutenant colonel and ordered him back to the Ohio country in the spring of 1754. This time, he would go with troops and orders to build a fort at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, the strategic heart of the Ohio Valley. What happened next would haunt Washington for years and help start a global war. In May 1754, Washington learned that a French force led by Ensign Joseph Coulon de Jumonville had camped in a rocky glen not far from Washington's position. Washington believed, or convinced himself, that this was a military force planning to attack. He decided to strike first. On the morning of May 28th, accompanied by about 40 Virginia militiamen and several Native American warriors led by a Seneca chief named Tanacharison, Washington surrounded the French camp at dawn. What followed remains disputed. Shots rang out, a brief firefight erupted in the wet woods, and within 15 minutes the battle was over. 10 or 12 French soldiers lay dead, including Jumonville. One account claims that Jumonville was reading a diplomatic summons when he was killed. Another suggests that Tanacharison executed the wounded Jumonville by splitting his skull with a tomahawk and washing his hands in the man's brains. Washington himself later wrote that he had heard bullets whistle and found something charming in the sound, a comment that would be widely criticized as bloodthirsty. Whatever the exact circumstances, Washington had ambushed and killed what the French claimed was a diplomatic party. The French called it assassination. The British and Virginians called it a military victory. Washington knew retaliation would come swiftly. He retreated to a place called Great Meadows and began building a fort, which he named with unintentional irony, Fort Necessity. The structure was pathetically inadequate, just a circular wooden stockade 7 feet high, surrounded by a shallow ditch. Tanacharison, the Native American chief who had fought alongside Washington at Jumonville Glen, tried to warn him that the fort was poorly positioned, surrounded by hills and woods that would give attackers perfect cover. Washington dismissed the concerns, convinced the fort could withstand any assault. On July 3, 1754, a force of about 600 French soldiers and 100 Native American allies appeared at the edge of the woods surrounding Fort Necessity. Washington's force of roughly 400 men, already exhausted and demoralized, retreated into the flimsy fortifications. Rain began to fall, turning into a torrential downpour that flooded the trenches Washington had ordered dug. The French didn't need to assault the fort. They simply took positions in the surrounding woods and poured musket fire into the exposed British position. All day the firefight continued, with Washington's men unable to effectively return fire while the French remained safely hidden. By evening, with casualties mounting and ammunition running low, Washington accepted the inevitable. When the French commander offered surrender terms, Washington agreed. He signed articles of capitulation written in French, which he couldn't read, and which his translator, Jacob Van Braam, apparently didn't fully explain. The document stated that Washington had assassinated Jumonville. When this became public, Washington claimed the translation was faulty, that he had been deceived. But the damage was done. His first independent command had ended in humiliating surrender, and he had inadvertently admitted to killing a diplomat under dubious circumstances. Necessity taught Washington lessons he would never forget. He learned that confidence without preparation leads to disaster. He learned that position matters in warfare, that terrain can make the difference between victory and defeat. He learned that Native American allies provided crucial intelligence and tactical advice that colonial officers ignored at their peril. Most importantly, he learned the bitter taste of failure, and he swore he would never surrender again. He resigned his commission shortly afterward, wounded in pride and reputation. But the war Washington had helped start continued without him. The British government sent Major General Edward Braddock with 2 regiments of regulars to finally drive the French from the Ohio Valley. When Braddock's expedition set out in 1755, Washington joined as a volunteer aide-de-camp, hoping to restore his reputation and learn from a professional British commander. What he learned instead was that British military doctrine could be fatally inadequate when applied to American warfare. On July 9, 1755, Braddock's force of about 1,300 men was approaching Fort Duquesne when they walked into an ambush. French regulars, Canadian militia, and Native American warriors struck from the woods, using cover and tactics the British considered cowardly. Braddock's troops, trained for European battlefield formations, tried to form neat lines while invisible enemies shot them down. Officers on horseback made perfect targets. The soldiers, confused and terrified, began to break ranks. Washington had been sick with dysentery for days, barely able to sit his horse. But as chaos engulfed Braddock's force, he rode up and down the line, trying to organize a defense, carrying orders, attempting to rally the men. 2 horses were shot out from under him. 4 bullets tore through his coat. Men fell all around him, but somehow he remained untouched. Braddock himself took a bullet through the lung and fell mortally wounded. The British retreat turned into a rout, with soldiers abandoning their wounded, their supplies, everything but their desperate desire to escape. Poisoned Washington helped organize the survivors' withdrawal, showing the kind of composure under fire that would become his trademark. Out of 1,300 men, nearly 1,000 were killed or wounded. The defeat was catastrophic, one of the worst in British military history. Yet Washington emerged with his reputation enhanced. He had shown courage when others panicked, had maintained discipline when everything fell apart, had saved what could be saved from complete disaster. The Virginia colonial government rewarded him with command of the Virginia Regiment, making him a colonel at just 23 years old. For the next 3 years, Washington led frontier defenses against French and Native American raids, learning logistics, personnel management, and the grinding reality of military life. He discovered he had a talent for organization, for managing supplies and men, for maintaining discipline without losing loyalty. He also discovered the limits of colonial military service. British regular officers looked down on colonial militia officers, treating even senior colonial commanders as inferior to the lowest British regular. Washington wanted a royal commission, wanted recognition as a proper British officer, but it never came. The rebuff stung, planting seeds of resentment he would remember later. By 1758, when British forces under General John Forbes finally captured Fort Duquesne, Washington had gained invaluable military experience. He understood terrain, logistics, and the importance of intelligence. He knew how to keep an army together through hardship. He had learned that British military power, while formidable, was not invincible. And he had proven to himself that he could command men in combat, that he could lead under pressure, that he had the physical and moral courage required of a soldier. These lessons would serve him well. But first, he would spend 15 years as a Virginia planter, building a life far from battlefields, never imagining that everything he had learned would be needed again to fight the very empire he had once longed to serve. The call to revolution. January 6, 1759, George Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis in her home at White House Plantation. The bride was a wealthy widow who brought to the marriage not just affection, but an enormous fortune. Her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, had died suddenly without a will, leaving Martha with a life interest in a vast estate that included thousands of acres and nearly 300 enslaved people. For Washington, who had spent his youth struggling for recognition and financial security, this marriage transformed everything. He became one of the wealthiest men in Virginia overnight. Blinds into life at Mount Vernon, the plantation he had inherited from his brother Lawrence. Over the following years, Washington expanded the main house from a modest farmhouse into an elegant mansion befitting his new status. He experimented with crop rotation, trying to move away from tobacco toward wheat and other grains. He bred horses, operated a fishery on the Potomac, even ran a whiskey distillery. He managed his lands with the same meticulous attention to detail he had applied to military matters, keeping careful records, planning improvements, constantly seeking ways to increase productivity and profit. Psychologists' market management required brutal calculations. Washington relied entirely on enslaved labor to operate Mount Vernon and its outlying farms. By the end of his life, 317 enslaved men, women, and children would live and work on his properties, their forced labor making his comfortable life possible. In these early years, Washington showed no signs of questioning the institution. He bought and sold enslaved people as needed, separated families when convenient, and viewed them primarily as property and investments. His account books recorded transactions alongside purchases of livestock and tools. Whatever moral qualms he might develop later, in the 1760s he was fully embedded in the slave-based economy that defined Virginia plantation society. Yet, even as Washington built his agricultural empire, the relationship between Britain and its American colonies was deteriorating. New taxes followed Britain's expensive victory in the French and Indian War. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, each one sparking greater colonial resistance. Virginia's House of Burgesses, where Washington served from 1758 onward, became a forum for debate about colonial rights. Washington mostly stayed quiet during these debates, preferring to listen and observe. But he signed non-importation agreements protesting British taxes, and he wrote letters to friends expressing growing frustration with parliamentary overreach. The change came gradually. Washington had once longed for a royal commission, had taken pride in serving the British crown. Now he began to see himself as a Virginian first, an American second, and a British subject only distantly. When Royal Governor Lord Dunmore dissolved the House of Burgesses in 1774, its inflammatory statements, Washington joined fellow Burgesses at Raleigh Tavern to continue their deliberations in defiance of the governor. He was becoming a revolutionary, though he might not have used that word yet. In September 1774, Washington rode north to Philadelphia as one of Virginia's delegates to the First Continental Congress. The Congress sought to coordinate colonial resistance to British policies, particularly the intolerable acts that had punished Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party. Washington said little during the debates, but his presence spoke volumes. He attended sessions wearing his old military uniform, a visual reminder that Virginia had men willing and able to fight if necessary. When delegates discussed military preparedness, everyone knew Washington had actual combat experience, something most of them lacked. The Congress adjourned in October without resolving the crisis. Delegates agreed to reconvene in May 1775 if Britain didn't address colonial grievances. Washington returned to Mount Vernon, hoping for peace, but preparing for war. He helped train local militia units, organized military supplies, and studied military treatises. He knew what combat meant, knew the costs of war in blood and suffering. But he also knew that sometimes principles mattered more than safety, that some injustices couldn't be endured quietly. On April 19, 1775, British troops and colonial militia exchanged fire at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. The war had begun. When the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia on May 10th, the delegates faced a new reality. They were no longer protesting policies, they were conducting a war. They needed to organize the militia gathering around Boston into an actual army. They needed a commander who could unite the colonies, who had military experience, and who could be trusted with enormous power. On June 14, 1775, Congress created the Continental Army. The next day, John Adams of Massachusetts nominated George Washington of Virginia to be its commander-in-chief. The choice was partly political, an attempt to bind southern colonies to a conflict that had begun in Massachusetts. But it was also practical. Washington was one of the few men in Congress with significant military command experience. He had led men in combat, had served for years in frontier warfare, had demonstrated courage and competence. Perhaps most importantly, he looked like a leader. At 6 feet 2 inches, with broad shoulders and an imposing presence, Washington commanded attention simply by standing up. When Congress unanimously elected him on June 15th, Washington rose to accept, with a speech that revealed both his character and his understanding of what lay ahead. He thanked the delegates for their confidence, but expressed profound doubts about his abilities. "I feel great distress from a consciousness that my abilities and military experience may not be equal to the extensive and important trust," he told them. He declined to accept a salary, asking only that his expenses be paid at war's end. Most significantly, he promised that his command would be subordinate to civil authority, that he would obey Congress, that he would never seek power beyond what they granted him. These might seem like standard humility, the expected modesty of a man receiving high honor, but Washington meant every word. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else in that room, the dangers of military power. He had seen British officers abuse their authority. He knew how easily an army could become an instrument of tyranny rather than liberty. By publicly committing to civilian control, by refusing a salary, by expressing uncertainty rather than arrogant confidence, Washington was setting a standard. He was declaring that this would be a different kind of army, led by a different kind of commander. Whether he could live up to that standard remained to be seen. Purification 1775, Washington left Philadelphia for Massachusetts to take command of the Continental Army. He had no idea what he would find in Cambridge, how long the war would last, or whether he would survive to see its end. As he rode north through summer heat, he might have remembered his first combat experience 20 years earlier, the humiliation of fought necessity, the lessons learned through defeat. He might have thought about the comfortable life at Mount Vernon he was leaving behind, the plantation and family that might never see him again. Or he might have simply focused on the immediate tasks ahead, organizing an army, preparing for battle, trying to match his skills against the greatest military power on earth. Whatever his thoughts, by the time Washington reached Cambridge on July 2nd, 1775, his old life was finished. The man who would save the revolution had taken the field. Triumph from despair. The situation Washington found when he arrived outside Boston in July 1775 would have overwhelmed most commanders. The Continental Army, as Congress grandly called it, consisted of about 15,000 militiamen from various New England colonies, with no unified command structure, no standard training, no reliable supply system, and no discipline worthy of the name. Officers had been elected by their men and often maintained their positions through popularity rather than competence. Soldiers came and went as they pleased, considered orders suggestions rather than commands, and treated camp more like an extended hunting trip than military service. Breaking began the grinding work of creating an army from chaos. He established clear chains of command, insisting that orders flow through proper channels rather than being shouted randomly by anyone who felt important. He instituted regular drill and training, worked to standardize equipment and procedures, and, most difficultly of all, tried to instill discipline in men who viewed discipline as European tyranny. Many resisted. They had come to fight the British, not to practice marching and take orders from Virginia aristocrats. Washington persevered, using a combination of threats, appeals to patriotism, and sheer force of will. Submerged, the siege of Boston lasted through the fall and winter. British forces held the city while the Continental Army surrounded it, neither side able to break the stalemate. Washington desperately needed artillery to force a decision. In a remarkable feat, Colonel Henry Knox brought 59 cannons 300 miles from Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, dragging them through snow and over frozen lakes to Cambridge. In March 1776, Washington had these guns positioned on Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston. The British commander, General William Howe, realized his position had become untenable. Rather than assault the heights and risk catastrophic losses, he evacuated Boston by sea on March 17th, taking his forces to Halifax to regroup. Washington had won his first major victory as commander-in-chief, driving the British from their stronghold without a major battle. It seemed like a good omen, but the celebration was brief. Washington knew Howe would return with reinforcements, and the likely target was New York City, the strategic key to controlling the Hudson River and splitting the colonies. Washington moved his army south, arriving in April 1776, to find a situation nearly indefensible. New York sat on islands surrounded by waterways where British naval superiority made defense nearly impossible. Through the summer of 1776, British forces massed near New York, while Washington tried to prepare inadequate defenses. Then, on July 4th, the Continental Congress formally declared independence, transforming what had been a rebellion into a war for a new nation. Washington ordered the declaration read to his troops, hoping it would inspire them for the battles ahead. They would need inspiration. By August, British General Howe had assembled over 30,000 troops, including thousands of German mercenaries called Hessians and hundreds of ships, the largest military force Britain had ever sent overseas. The Battle of Long Island in late August 1776 proved disastrous. Howe's forces outflanked the Continental Army, threatening to trap and destroy them. Only a miraculous overnight evacuation across the East River, covered by fog and executed with remarkable discipline, saved the army from capture. But it was a retreat nonetheless, the first of many. Through September and October, Washington withdrew from position after position as British forces pressed forward. The army fought delaying actions at Harlem Heights and White Plains, but these were tactical successes in a strategic disaster. Catastrophe reached its peak in November, when nearly 3,000 American troops surrendered at Fort Washington on Manhattan Island. Washington had argued against trying to hold the fort, but Congress and some of his generals insisted it could be defended. The loss was devastating, both militarily and psychologically. The Continental Army had lost precious men, supplies, and artillery it couldn't replace. Even worse, it had demonstrated that American forces couldn't stand against professional British and Hessian troops in conventional battles. Coinbase retreated across New Jersey with what remained of his army, perhaps 5,000 effective troops. British and Hessian forces pursued, snapping at his heels, capturing supplies and prisoners. Each day brought new deserters, as enlistments expired and men simply went home, believing the cause was lost. By December, the Continental Army had reached the Delaware River's western bank, and Washington ordered all boats collected or destroyed for miles to prevent British pursuit. General Howe, believing the rebellion essentially crushed, retired to comfortable winter quarters in New York. He left Hessian garrisons in New Jersey to hold the territory over winter, including a force at Trenton under Colonel Johann Rall. This was the moment when the revolution came closest to dying. The army was dissolving. Most enlistments would expire on December 31st, just weeks away, and few men seemed willing to re-enlist. Congress had fled Philadelphia for Baltimore, fearing British capture. Public support wavered as defeat followed defeat. Even Washington's fellow officers whispered doubts about his competence. Something dramatic had to happen, or the cause would simply fade away. Washington studied the situation with the cool analysis he had learned through years of surveying and military service. The Hessians at Trenton were isolated, separated from British support. Colonel Rall, confident the rebels were beaten, had failed to build proper fortifications. Christmas was approaching, a time when soldiers traditionally let their guard down. If Washington could strike suddenly and win decisively, it might restore hope and convince men to continue fighting. The risk was enormous. If the attack failed, if the army was destroyed in a desperate gamble, the revolution would end. But doing nothing guaranteed defeat. Washington decided to risk everything on a single roll of the dice. On Christmas afternoon, December 25, 1776, Washington issued orders for a complex operation. His army would split into 3 groups, crossing the Delaware at different points to attack the Hessian garrison from multiple directions. General James Ewing would cross south of Trenton to block escape routes. Colonel John Cadwalader would cross further south to engage British forces at Bordentown. Washington himself would lead 2,400 men across McConkey's Ferry, about 9 miles north of Trenton, then march south to attack the Hessians at dawn. The plan required precise timing and flawless execution. It got neither. As darkness fell on Christmas night, a nor'easter swept in, bringing freezing rain, sleet, and howling winds. The Delaware River, already dangerous, became a nightmare of ice chunks and freezing water. Washington's men used Durham boats, flat-bottomed vessels designed for cargo, not for ferrying an army across an ice-choked river in a winter storm. Each boat carried about 40 men, who sat exposed to sleet and spray, soaked through, freezing in temperatures that hovered around 30 degrees. Colonel John Glover's regiment of Marblehead fishermen and sailors operated the boats, using their seamanship to navigate conditions that would have defeated most men. Washington crossed with the first wave, standing in the bow of his boat, a tall figure silhouetted against the storm. The crossing took hours longer than planned. Men gripped their weapons with hands so numb they could barely feel their fingers. 2 soldiers would die from exposure before the night ended. By the time all troops reached the New Jersey shore, it was after 3 in the morning, and Washington's schedule had collapsed. Dawn would come before they reached Trenton, eliminating the crucial element of surprise. Discharged so Washington refused to turn back. The password he chose for the operation captured his state of mind. Victory or death. There would be no middle ground, no tactical retreat to fight another day. They would attack Trenton, regardless of circumstances, regardless of fatigue and freezing conditions, regardless of the odds. The army formed up in darkness and began marching south through the storm. Men wrapped rags around their feet to protect against frozen ground. Those who had ammunition kept it dry as best they could. Officers moved quietly up and down the column, keeping men moving, preventing anyone from sitting down to rest and never getting up again. The march to Trenton took longer than expected. Icy roads slowed progress, and men who had been awake all night stumbled with exhaustion. By the time Washington's force reached the outskirts of Trenton around 8 in the morning, full daylight had arrived. Surprise seemed impossible. Yet when the Continental Army advanced into the town from 2 directions, they caught the Hessians completely unprepared. Colonel Rowell had dismissed warnings about rebel attacks, confident that Washington's defeated army posed no threat. His troops were recovering from Christmas celebrations, many nursing hangovers. No one expected an assault through a winter storm. The battle lasted barely 90 minutes. Continental troops firing from the ends of streets trapped the Hessians in a deadly crossfire. The artillery Washington had struggled to bring across the Delaware opened up with devastating effect, firing down the main streets. The Hessians, professional soldiers who had never lost a battle, found themselves overwhelmed by an enemy they had considered beaten. Colonel Rowell, trying to rally his men and organize a counterattack, took a fatal bullet. His troops, confused and leaderless, began surrendering. When the shooting stopped, Washington had won a complete and astonishing victory. Nearly 900 Hessians were captured, with minimal American casualties. Only 3 Continental soldiers had been killed in action, and most of those died from exposure rather than enemy fire. The army had captured desperately needed supplies, weapons, and ammunition. But most importantly, they had proven they could win. After months of defeat and retreat, the Continental Army had struck back and won decisively. Washington wanted to press the advantage, to attack the British garrison at Princeton immediately. But his men were exhausted, and worse, most of their enlistments would expire in just days. He recrossed the Delaware with his prisoners and booty, hoping the victory would convince soldiers to re-enlist. Many did, moved by the triumph at Trenton and Washington's personal appeals. On December 30th, Washington led his reinforced army back across the Delaware. Sluggish responded by sending General Cornwallis south from New York with 8,000 troops to crush Washington's force. On January 2nd, 1777, Cornwallis reached Trenton and found Washington's army dug in along Assunpink Creek. Cornwallis launched several assaults trying to cross the creek, but was beaten back each time. As night fell, the British general decided to wait until morning to complete what he called bagging the fox. That night, Washington executed one of the war's most brilliant maneuvers. While leaving campfires burning and a small guard force to maintain the illusion of occupation, he marched his main army around Cornwallis's flank using back roads. By dawn, the Continental Army was behind British lines and approaching Princeton. The resulting battle was fierce and confused. American forces under General Hugh Mercer ran into British troops unexpectedly, and Mercer was mortally wounded in the fighting. The line began to waver until Washington himself rode forward, rallying the men within range of British muskets, his presence steadying them when they might have broken. The Continental victory at Princeton was narrower than at Trenton, but it completed what those victories accomplished together. In just 10 days, Washington had crossed an ice-choked river through a blizzard, won 2 significant battles against professional troops, captured over 1,000 prisoners, seized crucial supplies, and demonstrated that the Continental Army could fight and win. He had taken the bleakest moment of the Revolution and transformed it into renewed hope. The British evacuated most of their New Jersey positions and pulled back to New York. Recruiting surged as men who had considered the cause lost now believed independence might be possible. The Trenton-Princeton campaign became legendary, the stuff of paintings and stories told around fires. But for Washington, it was validation of something he had always believed. Victory required not just skill and courage, but also the willingness to risk everything when circumstances demanded it. He had gambled the entire revolution on a winter night's attack, and the gamble had paid off. The lesson would serve him well in the long years of war that still lay ahead, years that would test him in ways even Trenton couldn't prepare him for. The Valley of Shadows. The glow of Trenton and Princeton faded quickly as 1777 brought new disasters. British forces under General Howe outmaneuvered Washington at Brandywine Creek in September, opening the road to Philadelphia. On September 26th, Howe's army marched triumphantly into the American capital, while Congress fled to York, Pennsylvania. Washington attempted a counterattack at Germantown in October, but a promising assault dissolved into confusion and failure. By November, with winter approaching and the campaign season ending, the Continental Army found itself without a clear winter quarters location and running desperately short of supplies. Washington chose Valley Forge, a plateau about 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia, for winter camp. The position offered some strategic advantages, sitting between the British in Philadelphia and the Continental Congress in York, while protecting the surrounding farmlands from British raids. But as the army began arriving in mid-December 1777, those theoretical advantages meant nothing to soldiers who lacked adequate shelter, food, clothing, and supplies. Over the following months, Valley Forge would become synonymous with suffering, a winter that tested whether the Continental Army would survive at all. Praying, the numbers tell part of the story. Approximately 11,000 men arrived at Valley Forge that December. Within weeks, nearly 3,000 were listed as unfit for duty due to illness, lack of clothing, or complete exhaustion. At least 2,000 would die before spring, victims of typhus, typhoid fever, pneumonia, dysentery, and simple starvation. But statistics can't capture what those months actually meant, the daily reality of men trying to survive a Pennsylvania winter without proper resources. The soldiers spent the first weeks building huts, according to Washington's specifications. 14 by 16 feet, 6.5 feet high at the walls, built from logs and chinked with mud. 12 men would share each hut, sleeping on straw spread across the floor, if they had straw. Many had neither blankets nor proper clothing. An estimated third of the army lacked shoes. Men wrapped their feet in rags, and when they marched, their blood marked the frozen ground. Those who remained in camp huddled around inadequate fires, trying to conserve what little fuel they could scavenge from the surrounding area. The food situation descended into crisis. Congress and state authorities had promised supplies, but failed to deliver. The Continental Army's commissary system, never efficient, collapsed almost completely. For days at a time, soldiers received no meat, surviving on fire cake, a paste of flour and water cooked on hot stones, when they had flour. When supplies did arrive, they were often spoiled or inadequate for an army's needs. Men went days without eating, their strength fading, their health deteriorating. Diseases spread rapidly through crowded, unsanitary huts where weak men with compromised immune systems lived in close quarters. Washington wrote desperate letters to Congress, to state governors, to anyone who might help. His correspondence from Valley Forge reveals barely controlled fury at the incompetence and indifference that left his army to starve, while civilian contractors profiteered and officials squabbled over jurisdictions. On December 23, 1777, he wrote to Congress with barely concealed bitterness. "I am now convinced beyond a doubt that unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place, this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these three things: starve, dissolve, or disperse." Yet somehow the army held together, and Washington held the army together. His leadership during this crisis may have been more impressive than any battlefield victory. He shared his soldiers' hardships, living in a simple stone house at Valley Forge rather than seeking comfortable quarters in nearby towns. He visited camps regularly, speaking with officers and common soldiers, maintaining discipline while showing genuine concern for their welfare. When congressional critics suggested he was too cautious, too defensive, he quietly endured the attacks, while refusing to risk his army in desperate operations that would have destroyed it. Washington's ability to maintain morale while acknowledging difficulties rather than minimizing them proved crucial. He didn't tell his men that conditions were acceptable or that sacrifice would be easy. He told them the truth. The situation was desperate, the suffering real, the cause in danger. But he also told them that if they could endure, if they could maintain discipline and continue drilling even while hungry and cold, they would become an army capable of defeating the British. He asked them to suffer not meaninglessly, but with purpose, to see their hardship as the price of eventual victory. In February 1778, a Prussian military officer named Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge and transformed the Continental Army. Von Steuben had served in the army of Frederick the Great and understood professional military training. He couldn't speak English fluently, but he could demonstrate proper drill with a model company, and he could write clear, simple training manuals. With Washington's full support, von Steuben began teaching the Continental Army how to march in formation, how to load and fire muskets in precise sequence, how to maneuver on the battlefield like professionals rather than enthusiastic amateurs. The training was grueling, especially for men already weakened by malnutrition and disease. But it gave them something to do besides sit in huts and wait for spring. It gave them pride as they mastered techniques they had watched British and Hessian troops perform with ease. It gave them identity as soldiers rather than militia, as an army rather than a collection of regional units. By the time spring arrived and supplies finally began flowing more reliably to the camp, the Continental Army had been fundamentally transformed. The British evacuated Philadelphia in June 1778 and marched toward New York. The Continental Army pursued them with confidence and competence that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. At the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse on June 28th, Continental troops fought British regulars to a standstill in brutal 100-degree heat. The battle was technically inconclusive, with the British continuing their withdrawal to New York after nightfall. But the Continental Army had proven it could meet professional European troops on equal terms, could hold the field, could execute complex maneuvers under fire. Valley Forge didn't produce a great military victory. It produced something more important, an army that could win future battles, a military force that had survived its worst crisis and emerged hardened by the experience. The men who came out of Valley Forge in the spring of 1778 were not the same men who had arrived there in December 1777. They had endured privation that should have broken them, had maintained discipline when they had every reason to desert or mutiny, had trained and drilled even while starving. Polishing Washington emerged from Valley Forge with his reputation enhanced rather than damaged by the winter's suffering. Officers and men who might have blamed him for the disaster instead recognized that he had shared their hardship and fought tirelessly for their welfare. He had held the army together through sheer force of character when it should have dissolved. The British had hoped that winter would destroy the Continental Army. Instead, it forged that army into a weapon capable of winning American independence. The worst was not over. The war would drag on for 3 more years with fresh trials and crises. But Valley Forge had been the crucible, and the Continental Army had not merely survived, it had been reborn. The world turned upside down. Through 1778 through 1780 brought no decisive victory, but rather a grinding war of attrition that tested Washington's patience and strategic vision. The British, unable to crush the Continental Army in the northern states, shifted their focus south, hoping to rally loyalist support in the Carolinas and Georgia. From Washington's perspective in the north, this southern campaign was a disaster. Charleston fell to British forces in May 1780, with over 5,000 Continental soldiers surrendered in what became the single greatest American defeat of the war. General Horatio Gates, appointed Southern commander by Congress without consulting Washington, suffered a humiliating rout at Camden in August, then fled the battlefield so quickly that he rode 180 miles before stopping. Lost in the South while he remained unable to attack the British stronghold in New York. He needed a game-changing victory, something that would break the stalemate and force Britain to negotiate. That opportunity came in 1781, but it required patience, coordination with French forces, and the kind of strategic deception at which Washington had become expert. In early 1781, British General Cornwallis brought his Southern Army into Virginia, establishing a base at Yorktown on the York River. Cornwallis chose this position because it offered access to the Chesapeake Bay, allowing British ships to supply and reinforce his army. Washington, encamped with his Continental Army and French forces under Comte de Rochambeau outside New York, saw an opportunity if everything could be coordinated perfectly. French Admiral de Grasse was sailing from the Caribbean with a powerful fleet. If de Grasse could control the Chesapeake Bay while Washington and Rochambeau marched south, Cornwallis could be trapped between Franco-American forces on land and the French fleet at sea. The plan required remarkable secrecy and perfect timing. Washington needed to convince British commander Sir Henry Clinton that the Franco-American force planned to attack New York, not Yorktown. He ordered construction of visible camps and boats near New York, circulated false intelligence reports, and maintained all appearances of preparing for a New York assault. Meanwhile, he quietly prepared his army for a rapid march south. In late August, the combined Franco-American force of about 9,000 men began moving. They maintained the deception as long as possible, then turned south and raced for Virginia. Washington's army covered 200 miles in 15 days, an impressive feat of logistics and endurance. The French fleet, under de Grasse, arrived in Chesapeake Bay and defeated a British naval force in the Battle of the Capes on September 5th, establishing control of the waters around Yorktown. By mid-September, Washington had concentrated over 16,000 French and American troops around Cornwallis's 7,000 men. Cornwallis found himself in an impossible situation. He was trapped on a peninsula with his back to a river he couldn't cross, facing a superior force on land with no possibility of naval evacuation. Still, he held a fortified position with experienced troops, and he hoped Clinton would send reinforcements from New York before Washington could mount a successful assault. Washington had no intention of giving him that time. On September 28, 1781, Franco-American forces began encircling Yorktown. Over the following days, soldiers constructed parallels, siege trenches that zigzagged toward British positions, allowing attackers to move closer while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. French military engineers, among the best in the world, supervised the construction, while American and French soldiers dug through sandy Virginia soil under intermittent British artillery fire. The first parallel was completed by October 9th, bringing Allied forces within artillery range of Yorktown. Washington himself touched the match to the first American cannon, a symbolic gesture that demonstrated his presence and commitment. Over the following days, more than 40 French and American artillery pieces pounded British positions. The bombardment was devastating and continuous. Buildings in Yorktown burned. British artillery positions were systematically destroyed. Cornwallis's defences crumbled under the relentless fire. On October 11th, Allied forces began digging a second parallel, just 400 yards from British lines. But two British redoubts, small fortified positions, prevented completion of this parallel. These redoubts would have to be taken by assault, a dangerous proposition requiring troops to charge across open ground under defensive fire. Washington ordered simultaneous attacks on both redoubts for the night of October 14th. Redoubt 10 was led by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, Washington's former aide-de-camp, who had begged for a combat command. Hamilton's force of 400 men advanced silently through darkness, not firing until they reached the fortification. Then came a brief, fierce fight with bayonets and close combat. Within 10 minutes, Hamilton's men had taken Redoubt 10 with minimal casualties. Simultaneously, a French force under Vicomte de Deux Ponts captured Redoubt 9. With both positions secured, the Allies completed their second parallel and brought even more artillery to bear. Cornwallis understood the situation had become hopeless. On October 17th, a British drummer boy appeared on the parapets beating "Parley," the signal for a truce. A British officer with a white flag approached American lines, carrying Cornwallis's request for surrender terms. Washington granted a ceasefire while negotiators worked out the details. The surrender negotiations took 2 days. Washington insisted on terms that matched what the British had imposed on American forces when Charleston surrendered the previous year. The British would march out of Yorktown with colours cased and drums beating a British or German march, but they would not receive honours of war. Officers could retain their sidearms and personal property, but the army itself was captured. On October 19, 1781, the formal surrender ceremony took place. The British and German troops marched out of Yorktown between columns of French forces on one side and American forces on the other. According to tradition, the British band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," though this detail may be apocryphal. What is certain is that General Cornwallis claimed illness and refused to attend, sending his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, to surrender in his place. O'Hara attempted to surrender to Rochambeau, perhaps hoping to honor French military traditions and avoid the humiliation of surrendering to colonial rebels. Rochambeau pointed to Washington. When O'Hara approached Washington with Cornwallis's sword, Washington directed him to his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln, who had been forced to surrender Charleston and deserved the symbolic compensation. More than 7,000 British and German soldiers became prisoners of war. The Allies had captured artillery, supplies, and ships. More importantly, they had destroyed a major British army and proven that coordinated Franco-American operations could achieve decisive victory. News of Yorktown reached London in late November. Prime Minister Lord North reportedly exclaimed, "Oh God, it is all over." He was right. Though the Treaty of Paris wouldn't be signed until September 1783, Yorktown effectively ended the Revolutionary War. The British lacked the will and resources to continue fighting a war they now realized they couldn't win. For Washington, Yorktown was vindication of the strategy he had pursued since taking command in 1775. He had avoided risking the Continental Army in battles it couldn't win, had preserved his force through retreats and defensive operations, had waited for the right moment when victory was possible. Critics had called him too cautious, too reluctant to attack. But Washington understood something his critics didn't. The Continental Army didn't have to defeat the British in every battle. It just had to survive until Britain tired of the war. By keeping his army intact, by choosing his battles carefully, by finally striking decisively when the perfect opportunity presented itself, Washington had accomplished what once seemed impossible. He had defeated the world's greatest military power and secured American independence. The Greatest Act. Prevailing York 2 years following Yorktown tested Washington's character in ways battle never had. The war didn't end with Cornwallis's surrender. British forces still occupied New York, Charleston, and Savannah. Peace negotiations dragged on in Paris. The Continental Army remained in the field, and as months stretched into years with no resolution, the situation grew dangerous. Soldiers hadn't been paid in months, sometimes years. Officers had been promised pensions that seemed increasingly unlikely to materialize. The army was tired, broke, and felt betrayed by a Congress that couldn't, or wouldn't, fulfill its obligations. In March 1783, Washington faced what might have been his greatest crisis. At the Army's winter quarters in Newburgh, New York, anonymous letters circulated among the officers calling for action against Congress. The letters spoke of grievances and injustice, suggesting the Army should refuse to disband until paid, and hinting at darker possibilities, including military rule. Some historians believe the letters represented a genuine coup attempt, while others argue they were a negotiating tactic to pressure Congress. Whatever the intent, the situation was explosive. Washington called a meeting of officers on March 15th. He arrived unexpectedly, having not been invited to what was meant to be a gathering to consider the anonymous proposals. The officers fell silent as their commander entered. Washington pulled out a prepared speech and began reading his response to the letters. He condemned them as subversive and dangerous, appealing to the officers' honor and patriotism. Then, midway through reading a letter from a congressman, Washington paused, fumbled in his pocket, and produced a pair of glasses. Few of the officers had seen him wear spectacles before. "Gentlemen," he said, "you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown grey, but almost blind in the service of my country." The simple human moment broke the tension in the room. These officers had served with Washington for years, had seen him risk everything in their cause, had watched him age under the burden of command. The realization that he too had sacrificed, had given his health and years to their shared struggle, dissolved their anger. After Washington finished speaking and left the room, the officers voted unanimously to reject the anonymous proposals and reaffirm their loyalty to Congress and civilian authority. Washington had diffused a potential coup through the force of his character and the officers' respect for him personally. On September 3, 1783, American and British negotiators in Paris signed the Treaty of Paris, formally ending the Revolutionary War and recognizing American independence. By November, the last British troops evacuated New York City. Washington led his army into the city on November 25th, ending 8 years of British occupation. The war was truly over. Bankrupt, but November 4th, Washington gathered his officers for a farewell dinner at Fraunces Tavern in Lower Manhattan. The mood was subdued, emotional. These men had served together through impossible hardships, had seen countless comrades die, had somehow achieved what no one thought possible. Now they would part, most never to see each other again. Washington raised his glass and spoke briefly, his voice breaking with emotion. "With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you. I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable." He embraced each officer individually, too overcome to speak further. Then he walked out of the tavern, through a corridor of assembled officers and soldiers, to the waterfront, where a barge waited to carry him across to New Jersey. It was the first step on his journey home to Mount Vernon. But first, Washington had one more duty to perform. On December 23, 1783, he appeared before Congress, meeting in Annapolis, Maryland. In a packed chamber, before representatives of the nation he had helped create, Washington resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He pulled the document from his pocket and began reading. His hands shook. "Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theatre of action, and bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body under whose orders I have so long acted, I here offer my commission and take my leave of all the employments of public life." He handed his commission to the President of Congress and walked out of the room. He was a private citizen again, no longer commanding armies, holding no official position, wielding no power beyond what any other American possessed. The gesture seemed simple, almost anticlimactic, but its significance resonated around the world. Forging in London, King George III asked the American painter Benjamin West what Washington would do now that the war was won. West replied that he believed Washington would return to his farm. "If he does that," George III said, "he will be the greatest man in the world." The king understood what many of his contemporaries missed. In an age of monarchs and military strongmen, Washington had held supreme military command for 8 years, had been beloved by his army and country, and could probably have seized permanent power if he chose. Instead, he gave it all up and went home. The precedent would shape American democracy forever. Washington returned to Mount Vernon on Christmas Eve, 1783, having left 8.5 years earlier. He found his plantation in disrepair, his finances strained by years of neglect and the costs of war. His stepson had died during his absence, but he was home, he was alive, and his country was free. He threw himself into the work of agriculture with the same intensity he had brought to military command. He experimented with crop rotation, developed a distillery, bred mules, and tried to restore Mount Vernon's productivity. He wrote letters to former comrades and to friends in Europe, enjoying the peaceful life he had earned. Yet Washington couldn't fully escape public affairs. His correspondence reveals growing concern about the weakness of the new national government under the Articles of Confederation. The states acted like 13 separate countries rather than one nation. Congress couldn't raise taxes or regulate commerce effectively. Debts from the war went unpaid. When Shays' Rebellion erupted in Massachusetts in 1786, with armed farmers protesting taxes and foreclosures, Washington saw evidence that the Confederation was failing. Something had to change, or the independence they had won would be wasted on political chaos. That realization would draw Washington back into public service one more time, though he could not have known then what it would demand of him. He had resigned his commission, believing his service was complete. He couldn't have imagined that within 4 years he would be called on again, not to lead armies, but to help create and lead a new form of government. The greatest work of his life was still ahead. Forging a nation. In February 1787, Congress called for a convention to meet in Philadelphia that May to revise the Articles of Confederation. Washington received an invitation to serve as a Virginia delegate and agonized over whether to attend. He was 65 years old, suffering from rheumatism, tired after decades of public service. He had promised himself and Martha that his retirement would be permanent. Moreover, he worried about his reputation. If the convention failed to accomplish anything meaningful, his association with it would damage the prestige he had earned during the war. If he attended and the convention succeeded, he might be drawn back into public life permanently. James Madison and other friends urged him to attend, arguing that his presence would give the convention legitimacy and credibility it couldn't achieve without him. They reminded him that if the constitutional system failed, all his wartime sacrifices would be for nothing. Finally, reluctantly, Washington agreed. In May 1787, he traveled to Philadelphia and immediately faced the honor he had both expected and dreaded. On the convention's first day, the delegates unanimously elected him president of the proceedings. For the next 4 months, Washington presided over debates that would determine America's political future. The convention met in secret, with guards posted and windows kept closed despite Philadelphia's summer heat. Delegates agreed that nothing said in the room would be revealed until their work was complete, allowing for frank discussions without public pressure. Washington rarely spoke during debates, believing his role as presiding officer required impartiality. But his presence shaped everything. Delegates knew that whatever government they created, Washington would likely be asked to lead it. That knowledge gave them confidence to propose a strong executive branch that might otherwise have seemed dangerously close to monarchy. The convention quickly moved beyond its mandate to revise the Articles of Confederation. Led by Madison and others, delegates decided to create an entirely new framework of government. The debates were contentious, with fundamental disagreements over representation, federal power, and states' rights threatening to tear the convention apart. Large states wanted representation based on population, while small states demanded equal representation. Southern states wanted enslaved people counted for representation, but not taxation, while northern states objected. These disputes seemed irreconcilable. Washington watched the debates with growing anxiety. In late July, he wrote to Alexander Hamilton, expressing near despair about the convention's prospects. "I almost despair of seeing a favorable issue to the proceedings of our convention, and do therefore repent having had any agency in the business." But he kept the convention focused, enforced the rules of debate, and used his influence quietly to push toward compromise. The breakthrough came with the Connecticut Compromise, which created a bicameral legislature with proportional representation in the House and equal representation in the Senate. This solution, combined with the 3/5 compromise on counting enslaved people for representation, broke the deadlock. By September, delegates had crafted a constitution creating a federal government with real power, separated into executive, legislative, and judicial branches, with checks and balances limiting each branch's authority. Distinguished 17th, 1787, 39 of the convention's 55 delegates signed the Constitution. Washington signed first as president of the convention. Benjamin Franklin, looking at the sun painted on the back of Washington's chair, famously observed, "I have often looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting, but now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun." After the convention, Washington returned to Mount Vernon and began a quiet but determined campaign to secure ratification. He wrote letters to influential friends, encouraged supporters, and lent his enormous prestige to the Constitution's success. He never made public speeches or wrote essays like Hamilton, Madison, and Jay did in the Federalist Papers, but everyone knew Washington supported the Constitution, and that knowledge swayed many who might otherwise have opposed it. By June 1788, the required 9 states had ratified the document. The Constitution was now the law of the land. The new Constitution provided for presidential elections to take place in early 1789. Everyone knew who would be chosen. In April, when electoral votes were counted, George Washington received votes from every single elector, the only unanimous presidential election in American history. John Adams received the second highest vote total and became vice president. Washington received the news at Mount Vernon and spent several days saying goodbye to his home, his family, and the peaceful life he had briefly enjoyed. On April 16, 1789, he departed for New York City, the temporary capital, traveling through jubilant crowds in every town along the route. On April 30, 1789, on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York, Washington took the oath of office as the first president of the United States. He wore a brown suit of American-made cloth, symbolically choosing domestic manufacture over imported British fabric. Robert Livingston administered the oath using a Bible hastily borrowed from a nearby Masonic lodge. After repeating the oath, Washington added words not required by the Constitution. "So help me God." Then he bent forward and kissed the Bible, establishing precedents that would be followed by most of his successors. Washington delivered a brief inaugural address to a joint session of Congress, then nervously attended celebrations held in his honor. He was acutely conscious that everything he did was setting a precedent, that future presidents would look to his example. "I walk on untrodden ground," he wrote to a friend. "There is scarcely any part of my conduct which may not hereafter be drawn into precedent." The weight of that responsibility was crushing. He had helped create this new government, but now he had to make it work. Defining the presidency. The Constitution Washington swore to uphold provided only the barest outline of presidential powers and duties. It said the president would be commander-in-chief, would appoint federal officers with Senate approval, would execute the laws, and could veto legislation. But how would these powers be exercised? What was the proper relationship between president and Congress? How should a president behave, speak, dress, interact with citizens? Every choice Washington made would establish customs that might bind his successors for generations. He began by creating a cabinet, though the Constitution never used that word. Washington nominated Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. These 4 men became his principal advisors, meeting regularly to discuss policy. Washington treated them as consultants, whose advice he would consider seriously but not necessarily follow. He made final decisions himself, listening to competing viewpoints but accepting personal responsibility for outcomes. The relationship between Jefferson and Hamilton quickly became contentious. Hamilton believed in a strong federal government, a national bank, federal assumption of state war debts, and close ties with Britain. Jefferson favored states' rights, agrarian interests, strict constitutional interpretation, and friendship with France. Their philosophical differences reflected deeper disagreements about America's future. Washington tried to mediate between them, but their conflict grew into the foundation of America's first political parties, Federalists versus Democratic Republicans, exactly what Washington had hoped to avoid. Washington's first term focused on establishing governmental functions and dealing with immediate crises. He signed into law the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution protecting individual liberties. He appointed federal judges, including the first Supreme Court justices. He worked with Congress to create executive departments, establish federal courts, and set up a revenue system. He received foreign ambassadors and negotiated treaties defining presidential authority in foreign relations. Each action required careful thought about implications and precedents. His second term brought greater challenges. In 1793, revolutionary France declared war on Britain, expecting American support under the 1778 Treaty of Alliance. Washington knew that American involvement in European wars would be disastrous. The young nation lacked the military strength and financial resources to fight effectively. Moreover, American interests didn't require choosing sides in European power struggles. In April 1793, Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality, declaring that the United States would remain neutral in the conflict. The decision infuriated France and their American supporters, particularly Jefferson and his followers, but Washington held firm. In 1794, Western Pennsylvania farmers rebelled against federal taxes on whiskey, refusing to pay and threatening violence against tax collectors. The Whiskey Rebellion tested whether the new federal government could enforce its laws. Washington called up militia from several states and personally led an army of 13,000 men toward western Pennsylvania. The show of overwhelming force convinced rebels to disperse without major bloodshed. Washington's firm response demonstrated that the federal government, unlike the old Confederation, had power to enforce its authority. But he also showed restraint, pardoning most rebels and ensuring that force was proportional to the threat. Foreign policy dominated his second term. British forces still occupied forts in the Northwest Territory despite promises in the Treaty of Paris to evacuate them. British ships seized American vessels trading with France. War with Britain seemed possible. Washington sent Chief Justice John Jay to London to negotiate a resolution. The resulting Jay Treaty settled most disputes, but it was immensely unpopular, particularly among Jeffersonian Republicans who saw it as pro-British betrayal. Washington supported the treaty despite the political cost, believing it prevented a disastrous war. The controversy marked one of the few times Washington's judgment was widely questioned. Approved, through 8 years' ascents about presidential power and democratic governance. He demonstrated that a president could be powerful yet restrained, that civilian control of military was sacred, that personal ambition should never override the public good. He showed that a republic could have dignity and stability without monarchical trappings. Most importantly, when his second term ended in 1797, he voluntarily stepped down from power. Many urged him to seek a third term. The Constitution didn't limit presidential terms, but Washington refused, believing no president should serve indefinitely. His decision established an informal tradition that would eventually become the 22nd Amendment. Farewell to power. Breached. As Washington's second term drew to a close, he prepared to deliver a final message to the American people. He had intended to retire after his first term and had asked James Madison to draft a farewell address in 1792. but Hamilton, Jefferson, and others had convinced him to serve 4 more years. Now, in 1796, his decision was final. He was 64 years old, tired, criticized by partisan opponents in ways that wounded him deeply. He wanted to go home to Mount Vernon and spend his remaining years in the peace he had earned. In September 1796, Washington published his farewell address in the American Daily Advertiser newspaper. It was never delivered as a speech, but circulated widely through reprinting. The address synthesized 8 years of presidential experience into advice for future generations. Washington urged Americans to preserve the Union above all else, warning that sectional divisions and party conflicts threatened everything they had built. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, he wrote, is itself a frightful despotism. He cautioned against permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world, arguing that America should engage in commercial relations with all nations but avoid entangling political commitments. He emphasized that public credit was essential to national prosperity and security. He stressed the importance of religion and morality in maintaining republican government. Most powerfully, he reminded Americans that the Constitution and the Union were precious gifts that required constant vigilance to protect. The farewell address was Washington's final great contribution to American political thought. It would be read annually in Congress for decades, quoted by politicians across the political spectrum, and studied as fundamental wisdom about democratic governance. Washington wasn't naive about human nature or political conflict. He understood that factions and partisan battles were inevitable, but he believed Americans could maintain unity despite disagreements, that commitment to constitutional principles and national interest could overcome partisan passion. In March 1797, Washington attended the inauguration of his successor, John Adams. Then he rode out of Philadelphia toward Mount Vernon, experiencing for the first time in decades complete freedom from public responsibility. Citizens along his route turned out to cheer him, to thank him, to say goodbye to the man who had been at the center of American public life for 22 years. At each stop, Washington received honors and addresses. He responded with brief, gracious replies, always emphasizing that the nation belonged to its citizens, that America's future depended on their wisdom and virtue, not on any individual leader. He reached Mount Vernon in mid-March 1797 and threw himself into agriculture with the same intensity he had brought to war and politics. He rode his farms daily, inspected crops, managed enslaved laborers, experimented with crop rotation, and entertained a constant stream of visitors who wanted to meet the famous general and former president. He corresponded with friends across America and Europe, stayed informed about political developments, and enjoyed his grandchildren. For the first time since 1775, when he had taken command of the Continental Army, Washington was not responsible for anyone's fate but his own. Washington grappled with moral contradictions he could never fully resolve. Mount Vernon's operations depended entirely on enslaved labor. Washington had been born into a slave-owning society and had accepted slavery without question as a young man. But his views had evolved during the Revolution, when he commanded black soldiers and saw enslaved people fight for their own freedom. By the 1790s, he privately opposed slavery and wanted to end it. But he felt trapped by financial constraints, by family obligations concerning dower slaves he couldn't legally free, and by fear that any public anti-slavery stance would split the fragile Union. 1799, Washington wrote his last will and testament, addressing the slavery issue in the only way he felt he could. The will directed that all 123 enslaved people he personally owned should be freed upon Martha's death. This was a revolutionary act for a wealthy Virginia planter. Most of Washington's contemporaries either never freed their enslaved people or freed only a handful. Washington was the only major founding father to arrange mass emancipation in his will. The document also provided for elderly or infirm freed people to be supported by his estate, and for young people to be educated and trained in useful occupations. But the will also revealed the limitations of Washington's actions. He couldn't free the 153 people owned by the Custis estate who had come to Mount Vernon through Martha's first marriage. Virginia law prevented him from touching dower property. Many enslaved families at Mount Vernon included both people Washington owned and dower slaves. His emancipation would tear these families apart. The moral complexity paralyzed him. He wanted to do right, but couldn't find a way that didn't cause terrible harm. His solution freed some, while condemning others to continued bondage. Washington's final months were peaceful. He continued his routine of riding his farms, managing operations, entertaining visitors. On December 12, 1799, he rode for several hours through cold rain and snow, inspecting his properties. He returned home soaked and didn't bother changing out of wet clothes before dinner. The next day, December 13th, he woke with a sore throat, but insisted on going outside to mark trees for removal. By evening, his condition had worsened. That night, he could barely breathe. 3 physicians attended him the next day, December 14th. They applied the standard treatments of the era: bloodletting, blistering, purgatives. They drained nearly half his blood, desperate to cure what modern physicians believe was acute bacterial epiglottitis. The treatments only weakened him further. By evening, Washington knew he was dying. He gave his final instructions to his secretary, arranged his papers, and faced death with the same calm courage he had shown throughout his life. "I die hard," he told those around his bed, "but I am not afraid to go." Epilogue: The Immortal Legacy. News of Washington's death spread slowly across the young nation, traveling by horseback and ship to cities and towns that had known no America without him. When the reports reached Philadelphia, Congress adjourned immediately. Members wore black crepe armbands for months. President John Adams proclaimed a national day of mourning. In cities and towns across America, more than 400 memorial services were held between December 1799 and February 1800. Citizens wore mourning badges, draped buildings in black bunting, and attended ceremonies where speakers tried to capture what the nation had lost. Revoked. Henry Lee, Washington's old comrade from the Revolution, delivered one of the most famous eulogies. Standing before Congress, Lee spoke words that would echo through American history. First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen, he was second to none in humble and enduring scenes of private life. Pious, just, humane, temperate, and sincere. Uniform, dignified, and commanding, his example was as edifying to all around him as were the effects of that example lasting. But who was George Washington, really? Not the marble statue or the face on currency, but the actual man who lived 67 years through 3 very different phases of American history. He was born a subject of the British Crown, fought for that crown, then led a rebellion against it. He was a Virginia planter who depended on enslaved labor, yet came to oppose slavery. He was a soldier who hated war, a leader who didn't want power, a commander who won by avoiding battle. The contradictions don't diminish him, they make him more remarkable. Washington succeeded not despite his flaws, but because he recognized them and worked constantly to overcome them. He knew he lacked the education of Jefferson or the eloquence of Adams. He knew his military record included defeats and mistakes. He knew he hadn't freed all the enslaved people at Mount Vernon, knew he had failed to meet his own moral standards. These failures haunted him because, unlike many leaders, he actually held himself to high standards and recognized when he fell short. What made Washington indispensable was not genius or brilliance, but character. He had extraordinary self-discipline, refusing to let his fierce temper control him. He had physical courage tested repeatedly in combat, but his greatest courage was moral. He repeatedly chose duty over ambition, public good over personal interest. When victory seemed impossible, he kept fighting. When power was within his grasp, he walked away from it. When death approached, he faced it without fear. Consider what he did and what he didn't do. He commanded armies but never sought military rule. He presided over the Constitutional Convention but didn't try to shape the Constitution to serve his interests. He was elected president unanimously, but voluntarily stepped down after 2 terms. Each time he could have seized more power, he chose restraint. Each time he could have become a dictator, he chose to remain a citizen. Washington understood something profound about power and leadership. He knew that the greatest leaders serve something larger than themselves. He saw himself not as America's savior, but as its servant. When he resigned his commission in 1783, and when he left the presidency in 1797, he was declaring that the nation belonged to its people, not to any individual, no matter how distinguished. He was establishing that in America, power would be temporary and transferable, that elections would determine leadership, that no one was irreplaceable. This was revolutionary. In 1783, the idea that a victorious military commander would voluntarily surrender power was so unusual that King George III called it the greatest act of the age. In 1797, the peaceful transfer of presidential authority from one party to another seemed almost miraculous to observers who knew only centuries of monarchical succession and violent regime changes. Washington made both acts seem natural, even inevitable, establishing precedents that became the foundation of American democracy. His legacy includes the victories at Trenton and Yorktown, the Constitution he helped create, the presidency he defined. But his greatest legacy might be what he didn't do. He didn't make himself king. He didn't suspend constitutional government. He didn't cling to power when his time was finished. By showing what American leaders should not do, Washington may have contributed more to democratic tradition than all his positive accomplishments combined. The final irony is that Washington, who doubted his own abilities and reluctantly accepted public service, became the most essential figure in American history. The nation likely couldn't have won independence without him. The Constitution probably would have failed without his support. The presidency might have become dictatorial without his example of restrained power. As historian James Flexner wrote, Washington was the indispensable man. Not because no one else could have done what he did, but because no one else did do it when it mattered most. Pedestrians, more than 2 centuries after his death, Washington remains the standard by which American leaders are measured. We ask whether our presidents have Washington's integrity, whether our generals display Washington's restraint, whether our citizens possess Washington's commitment to putting nation before self. We probably idealize him too much, forgetting his flaws and failures. But the idealization itself matters. It creates a standard, an aspiration, a reminder that leadership should be about service rather than power. On February 22nd each year, we celebrate Washington's birthday. We should remember not just what he achieved, but how he achieved it. With patience when others demanded immediate victory, with restraint when others urged aggressive action, with humility when others offered him unlimited power, with sacrifice when others sought personal gain. He wasn't a perfect man, but he tried to be a good one. In the end, that effort to be good, that daily choice to act with integrity, even when it cost him dearly, defines his legacy more than any battlefield triumph or political achievement. George Washington died on December 14th, 1799, but the example he set lives on in every peaceful transition of power, in every president who voluntarily leaves office, in every military leader who obeys civilian authority. He taught Americans that democracy requires more than good laws and institutions. It requires leaders willing to restrain their own power, citizens committed to something larger than themselves, and a shared belief that the nation belongs to its people, not to any individual, no matter how great. Catastrophic, that is why, More than 200 years later, he remains first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen.